All right, we are going live now. So we are on Facebook Live, Matt Friedman. Welcome, namaste, and welcome to the Author Experience Conversations. We are launching season 6 with you, and we are very happy to have you here to discuss your book and share all about your life story and the work that you're doing on to address the issue of trafficking, human trafficking, and global slavery, along with your Sena half, Sylvia U. Friedman. So, welcome once again.
Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to be here today.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Matt. Matt, just to tell you about what we have been doing with the Author Experience Conversations. We started this sometime during the first lockdown in 2020, and we've continued to have several authors from around the world. Last season, which was season 5, we just had 5 authors, which included Bishop Ria, who is the person who facilitated the entire Oslo Peace Accord in 1992. We also had Sanjay Jha to discuss his insights on Indian politics because India as a country is undergoing the elections right now, and there's a lot of anticipation and anxiety about who the next PM would be. A lot of people in India surely don't want the current PM to be the next PM because there are a lot of issues about communal disharmony and promoting the communal agenda. We then had Rusty Labushkagne, who has a very, very interesting story of resilience, is one of our heroes who's featured in our Karma Kari Karishma book, which tells stories of resilience and shares insights on the science of resilience. And Rusty has a very interesting story. He's been to prison for 10 years for a murder that he did not commit. And he's going to be sharing his story in the Mojosh Magnificent 7 event series that we are launching later this year. And we would love to have you and Sylvia also as a part of this. And we had General Ian Cardozo, a man who cut his own leg with a kukri, which is a knife from Nepal. You have served in Nepal, so I'm sure you're familiar with the kukri. And then with an artificial leg, he fought the Indian government to serve in another war and fought in another war with an artificial leg. And of course, we had Marina Lazarus, who's an actor and a therapist from the UK. And today we have you discuss your book, Where Were You? A Profile of Modern Slavery, and to also talk about all the work that you've been doing in the sector of trafficking. So tell us what inspires you, Matt, to do this work, which requires a lot of grit, determination, and resilience. I mean, I do a lot of activism myself, and at times it's very difficult to stay motivated, stay inspired, especially when you're fighting against global forces who are against you for addressing the issue of slavery or war or genocides and human trafficking. So tell me, what keeps you inspired and what keeps you and Sylvia inspired to continue doing this work?
Well, I guess the answer to that question comes down to having been exposed to the issue of human trafficking and having interviewed literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people over time, and then hearing their story and recognizing the extent to which there's suffering in the world that a lot of people don't know about it. So my first exposure to this was about 35 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and my job was to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, we were finding girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. We couldn't understand what was going on. This is a very conservative culture. So we went to the shelters where these girls were, and we sat down and we listened to the stories that they had. And the story often went something like this. A human trafficker, a guy around 20 years old, would go into a remote village, flash a bunch of money around, and say he's looking for a wife. He says, I don't want an urban wife, I want a village wife. Find a girl, 12, 13 years old, befriend her. As you know, in Nepal and other parts of South Asia, you can marry young. He goes to the family and says, I'd like to marry your daughter. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, going to take care of our daughter, he's going to take care of us. They have an actual wedding ceremony. The entire community is there. After that, he goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district. When she gets there, she thinks she's still in Nepal. This girl's never been more than 20 kilometers away from, her village. She doesn't know anything about the world. When he's there, he puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she saw these girls dressed funny. She says, no, 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 don't leave me. I'm very scared. He says, it's okay. I'll be right back. He then goes to the madam to get the 500 US dollars for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding, and he hands the wedding pictures over. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 30, 40, 50 times in a year. After that, the madam goes into the room and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day, every day, because I say so. You can imagine her shock. No, 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 no. My husband loves me. No, that's what happened. When she internalizes this, many of them say, I'll kill myself before I do those shameful things. I'm a good Hindu girl. After that, the madam takes out the photo of the family and says, here's your mom, your dad, your brother. You hurt yourself, we're going to hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. As you know, in order to make a prostitute in that type of the part of the world, you just shame somebody. So they bring in some men, and over, they use the girl until she's broken in, and eventually just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she'll be with 20 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years, she gets what's called black eye, where she's so depleted physically and emotionally that nobody wants her. So they throw her out onto the street. So I was hearing this story over and over again from the girls that had made it back from India to Nepal, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me, went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this Caucasian guy, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me, and said, save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying. I turned to the police officer and said, we need to get this girl out of here. He said, well, we can't do that. So what are you talking about? You're a police officer. He says, well, if we try to leave with her now, we'll both be killed. To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. Now I tell that story because, I didn't wake up when I was 15 years old and say, when I grow up, I want to become an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be an activist. I wanted to live the good life and, move up in the US government system, and you have good jobs and a big house and all the things that people strive for. But every once in a while in life, we are tested. That was my big test, and I failed miserably. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, and I did what a lot of activists eventually do, surrendered to the fact that now that I've been exposed to this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 35 years later, here I am talking to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matt, for sharing that. A lot of what you discussed and described about how you were introduced to the concept of trafficking in the first person by meeting people who were survivors of trafficking is what a lot of people in India and South Asia and maybe the world around have seen in movies like some Slumdog Millionaire and movies like Salam Bombay, which was made by Meera Nair or almost 35 years ago. And I don't know whether I should say I'm happy to tell you or sad to tell you, but I have worked in the slums of Kamatipura, which is one
Mm-hmm.
of the biggest sex work districts in South Asia, if not Asia. And uh, I would actually call that my life of school and the University of Hard Knocks, because
Yes,
that is the place where I actually discovered myself from being a rebel without a cause to becoming a
yes,
rebel with a
yes.
cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I volunteered there way back in my college days when I was escaping from life myself.
Yes.
And I couldn't really kind of do much work with the women out there, so I found myself to be more of a liability than an asset. So I started working with the
Mm-hmm.
kids, trying to convince them to go back to school. And
Sure, sure, sure.
I witnessed everything that you're speaking about, because when I would speak with the women over there, I used to call them Didi, which means big sister. I
Bigger
was a
sister, yes,
16,
yes,
17-year old. And
yes,
that's when I would realize, and one of the thought which struck me at that time at a very young age is that everyone calls them bad women, dirty women. But most people don't realize that they're mothers who have to sleep with 20, 30, 40 men to
yes.
feed their children. And if they'd understood that plight, they would understand that this is not just hard work. This is harder than most hard work, which most people don't even witness in the corporate life or the UN life. So thank you for sharing that, Matt. And I relate with that. And I think a lot of people should know what really happens in the brothels of India or the brothels of Asia and the brothels around the world. So, Matt,
Mm-hmm.
before we go forward, I would like to know more. I've read everything that you're doing with along with Sylvia, but I would like to know in the first person what has been your life journey right from childhood to now, and what going forward. So you have 9 to 10 minutes Just tell us your life story, your journey of life. You are a storyteller now, and I do know that you've got to know the fear of public speaking and storytelling also. Maybe you want to cover that in your life story, or we'll talk more about that later. But
Okay.
over to you. The virtual stage is all yours.
Well, I mean, I grew up in a household that had five siblings in a small community outside of a small city. And my destiny was set to basically live in Connecticut, work in Connecticut, die in Connecticut, have a family in Connecticut. That was just the way, we saw kind of the trajectory of what my life would be. But something very interesting happened in my life when I was in college. I had finished a undergraduate degree in psychology, and I went to New York City to study at NYU. I was going to get a PhD. I was in my second, third years of my PhD, and I was working because I had very little money, available to me, and so I was kind of a starving student. And the job that I had was the American Health Foundation. So what I would do is I would go from Manhattan, which is a island, to the Bronx, which is across the bridge, and then I would work with students and so forth. On one of my trips, I was driving across the Brooklyn Bridge, and my taxi got into a terrible car accident. He happened to be driving in the left lane, pulled into the right lane where the traffic was stopped, and then smashed into the back of a car. And so I was thrown forward, and then another car came from behind. Um, he got out of the car because he wasn't supposed to be working and ran away. And I was in the back of a car unconscious that was burning. And as a result of all of that, I had a terrible kind of series of injuries that resulted in me not being able to continue my PhD for a semester. So I took a semester off. And so during that time, I had a friend who worked for the United Nations. She said, "Well, you're not doing anything. Why don't you write a background paper on Zambia?" I said, "Zambia? Where's Zambia?" I had to look on the map. Americans don't know anything about geography. So I recognized that it
Okay.
was in Africa. And so I did this paper, and it was about maybe 60, 70 pages. And back then there were no computers. So you're writing this by hand, and then you're typing it, and then editing it, and then retyping it, and everything else. The whole process took forever. So I handed the paper in, and she said, "Okay, well, we'll read it." 2 weeks later, she came back and said, "Read it. Okay, when can you go to Zambia?" I said, "Excuse me?" She said, "Yeah, we need you to go to Zambia to be a part of an evaluation team." I said, "I grew up in Connecticut. For me to go from like Connecticut to New York takes 6 weeks of planning, visas and passport. We don't travel. Friedmans don't travel." She said, "You got to travel." I said, "No, no, no, no. I can't do it. I can't do it. Get a passport. You're going to be on a plane. It's going to be on this particular date and time." And so finally, I did what she did. Said, I got my passport. We got the plane tickets. I was so scared, so intimidated by this idea of going off. And I had only been on like two planes before that. And so, this was a big adventure. Flew from United States to Kenya first, spent a couple of days there, then went to Zambia, spent 3 weeks there, then went to Switzerland. And I just fell in love with the concept of traveling to go to a place to basically work on something that helps people. At that particular time, I was focusing on health issues. I had never taken a public health course, but I did this assignment. And then after that, I kept getting more assignments and more assignments. And I didn't finish my PhD. I just decided that, I want to do this other thing. I'll get around to it at some point, but never did. So I was 3 years into a PhD. I could have gotten my doctorate, and it never happened. But something about like kind of being in foreign places and experiencing a completely different form of life seemed to be very much in my DNA. I didn't know it until I actually went to do these types of things. So that's kind of how I got into the international development space. Since then, I've traveled to 70 countries. I've worked in maybe 45 countries. I spent a lot of time in South Asia. I was in Nepal for 8 years, Bangladesh for 5 years. Then I went to Thailand for another 10 years. And during the time that I was there, I worked for USAID. And my job was basically to do both public health. And because I was becoming more and more interested and involved in human rights and human trafficking, they had me do those activities. From there, I jumped ship and I went to the United Nations, and I ran one of the largest counter trafficking programs in the world. So that's one element of my journey. The fact that I broke out of this sense that as a young, bush, kind of shy, timid boy in New England, now all of a sudden here I am all over the world doing these types of things. Another thing, to go back to the point that you were making about my public speaking, when I was in the third grade, I wasn't a very good student. And so one of the assignments was to write about one of our presidents, Abraham Lincoln. I was supposed to write a paragraph. And so I woke up that morning and I didn't do it. And so I went to an encyclopedia. Again, this is well before the internet. There's no internet. You go to an encyclopedia, and I copied word for word what was in the encyclopedia. Now, that's plagiarism. And so I went in, I thought I was so clever. I handed my paper in, and it came back with an F. And, I was a little bit taken aback. Why would I get an F? I had this perfect description of what was happening. And so the teacher said, Matt, did you write that? And I said, yeah, obviously. Look at my handwriting. I mean, did you write it? Was that your words? Oh, yeah, yeah. I lied. Anyways, so she said, could you please stand up? So I stood up and she made me read it. And I couldn't because I was a little third grader and I couldn't understand the words that I had written in there. So it so embarrassed me that it created this fear of public speaking, to the extent that for much of my life, up until about 15 years ago, I just, the night before, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I was so anxious. I just felt like I wanted to run away from the situation. But over time, I came to realize, I'm in a development job. I have to do this on a regular basis. I can't be fearful of this. I got to get over this. And so whenever an opportunity came up, I'd raise my hand. The other hand's trying to pull it down to say, don't do this. But through sheer just driving force to do it over and over and over and over again, I eventually got to a point where I could public speak pretty well. And then I could public speak pretty well beyond that. And I actually enjoyed doing public speaking. And the point of that for me is, and it relates to other aspects of our life, is that we as human beings are held back by our fears. We're fear of success, fear of public speaking, fear of, getting out there and telling our leaders, the people we work with, what we want to do and so forth. And as a result of that situation, it holds us back. And so having gotten over my public speaking, I came to realize the relevance and the importance as human beings of basically addressing this type of thing. The last thing I'll talk about is just, the journey as it relates to dealing with human trafficking. As I said, I probably come in contact with at least 1,000 victims over time. When I was in Nepal, many of the victims that I was working with were very young, and they all died, all 350 of them, of HIV/AIDS. And so basically you have a situation where not only is that person's life taken away from them, but also to add insult to injury, they die as a result of that situation. Nobody's there to care for them because, as you say, a lot of people look at them as bad girls, as some degenerates and so forth, when in fact they had nothing to do with how they got into that situation.
Right.
But culture often doesn't have a tremendous amount of compassion, especially when it comes to sexuality, especially when it comes to the types of things that happens in prostitution. As a result of that, they're shunned. And as much as we've tried to change that over time, that's the type of thing that to change traditions and customs and so forth takes a long time. So that's kind of what my story is in a couple of different dimensions.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for sharing that. It's been an interesting journey, and I think I'm sure that you enjoyed the journey all. So, one of the things which I picked up and which I heard you say is that because of an incident in school where a teacher picked on you and made you narrate what you had written, is how the fear set in. The amygdala, as we say, captured that fear, which used to hijack you, where you used to mostly not fight but flight when it came to
Yeah.
public speaking. So, what
Yeah.
what what do you think are the insights you want to share with our viewers, with all our young viewers, our readers, people who love reading books and people who love learning? What are the insights you want to share about how does one overcome fear? Because, like there's an old saying, right, that courage is not the absence of fear, but courage and bravery is more about understanding what your fears are and then figuring out how to overcome them. So, what are the insights that you have? What are the life lessons that you have about how people can overcome fears?
Well, I mean, I think the first point that I would mention is exactly what you just said, figuring out what your fear is. The thing is kind of when you get your hand close to a fire, when you get close to it, you can actually feel the pain and feel the heat and so forth. And so in life, there are certain emotional scenarios that take place where you get close to a particular thing. And then for whatever reason, you get anxious, you get depressed, you get sad, or various other things that could be fear-based type of scenarios. So understanding what your fear is an important part of the process. Um, we'll talk about, I'm an author, so I'll talk about writing. There's a lot of people who really want to be authors, but they're fearful of it. They're afraid that, well, if I write something, it won't be good. If I write something, maybe it won't get published. If I write something, maybe people will say, who are you to write something? What do you know? That type of thing. And as a result of that, very talented people are out there don't necessarily kind of step up and kind of get involved in experimenting with writing. The interesting thing about writing is 10% of the process. 90% of writing is rewriting. So you're just improving and improving and changing and improving and change. And I have 15 books in print. My first one, I'm really kind of embarrassed of that particular book because I didn't know anything about writing. My last book, I feel pretty comfortable. It's being published by Penguin Random House. To go from Vikas in India publishing my first book to Random House is a big jump. But it's just because I spent a lot of time basically just practicing and experimenting and having people look at my work and say, it's not very good, or I don't like it, or why are you doing it that way? And your feelings get hurt, and that's okay. The other thing to get over more than anything else is caring what people think about what you do and say and how you behave. I mean, I'm saying that from the standpoint of, normal behavior, not crazy behavior. But, a lot of people are so concerned about what their family is going to say or their friends are going to say or society is going to say that intimidation prevents them from moving forward. And part of the reason why authors don't move forward is they're afraid, well, what if I write about something and somebody criticizes it or says something about it or doesn't agree with me? That's okay. If you want absolute freedom in your life, what you got to do is get over that and not care. So I have this phrase where I say, I care so much that I don't care at all. And what that means is that in the work that I do, in my early career, I was so concerned about what my bosses would think, and I would kiss ass and I would, do the various things to try to please them and so forth. When in fact, in my mind, I was feeling like, well, I didn't always agree with them, or I felt like we should go off in a different direction, but I wouldn't say that because I was intimidated by the process. When you get to a point where you realize, especially in the work that I do, you're dealing with real human beings with real issues and problems that have to be addressed. And if you don't address what you feel about it, having experienced this, then you're doing a disservice to them. So it's not about me, it's about the people I'm serving. It's not about my book, it's about what the book is saying to convince people to step up and get involved and do things. So forget about Matt Friedman as an author. I'm just the means to the end of pulling the book together and having it take place. But anyone who really feels like, they want to write a book, they should do it. In fact, I'll just tell you one story related to how I got my first book published. In Nepal, back in the early 90s, the electricity would go off at around 8 or 9 o'clock every night. There was no TV. There wasn't nothing to do, but I had a laptop. So I decided I was going to write a short story. So I started it and it got to 20 pages and I didn't know how to end it. So it went to 30 pages. Then it went to 40 pages. Then it went to 50 pages. And I spent a long time practicing with it and experimenting and so forth. Finally got to 150 pages because short stories are harder to write than something longer. And I finished it. And I had a friend named Ravi, and Ravi came to me and said, "Oh, I hear you're writing this book." I said, "No, no, no, it's terrible. It's awful. Nobody's going to want to read it and so forth." He says, "You got to give it to me. I want to look at it." So I said, "Okay, I'll give it to you, but you got to give me your honest opinion. Okay. Be straight with me. Tell me what you really think about it." So I gave it to him. A month went by, 2 months went by, 6 months went by. And I saw him a couple of times and I'm thinking, wow, he didn't even mention it. It must be so bad that, like, oh my gosh, he just can't even have this conversation. My feelings were hurt by that. Then, in the seventh month, I got a letter from Vikas. He submitted the manuscript because he knew I never would. And so they agreed to publish the story. And so I'm not an author that does development work. I'm a development person who just happens to be published because I've always felt like, my writing is, I'm always surprised when somebody wants to publish my books. I mean, to me, it's more like a hobby. I write because I want to express myself. I write because it sometimes helps me to figure out what my feelings are. I write sometimes because it's therapeutic. I write sometimes because I see an injustice that I can't not do something about. And as a result of all of those things, it results in me actually being fairly prolific. But I don't do it because I'm thinking that I'm doing this because I want to get it published as much as I'm doing it because I can't not do it. And that's a real writer, a person who can't stop themselves. They have to get their voice out there.
Absolutely echoes my sentiments, Matt, because I love what you said. That is 10% writing, 90% rewriting. Mea culpa, because I sometimes marvel and wonder how authors say that they complete their books in 3 months or 6 months. And with all due respect to them, I find it very difficult to do that because a lot of thought goes into what I'm writing, and what I write in the morning is probably what I scrap in the evening. And it takes probably 2 weeks to get a chapter right. Yeah. And besides the 90% reading, rewriting, and the 10% writing, it takes me another 100% of research, right? And it probably takes me around 3.5 to 4 years before I get a book right and I feel it's good to go for publishing. My first book was published in 2013, and I tell stories of real heroes. And I know you have a book called Be the Hero, Be the Change. Was that your first book?
I know that was like 12th book.
12th book. Okay, so
Yeah,
what is the
the
first one?
interesting yeah, the interesting thing about that is so I do a presentation to 100 people on human trafficking. Then 10 people will come up to me and say, Matt, for whatever reason, this issue, it just breaks my heart. I need to do something. What can I do? The other 90 either have other issues or they don't know what their issues are.
Right.
But at the same time, what you have is a situation where um, each of us has an issue. We don't pick our issues or our causes. Our causes pick us.
Very
For me,
nice.
every time I look to the left or the right, there was human trafficking. For my sister, she doesn't care about human beings. She cares about animals. My brother, it's all about climate.
Yeah, we
So
all have a
every
cause dear to our heart.
yeah, and what makes your heart sing. So, like, if you don't know what your cause is, then you need to go and look for it, and you'll find it. You can just read newspaper articles or watch videos or whatever, and eventually there'll be something that draws you in. So, the book "Be the Hero" basically said, with all of the issues that we face in the world, girls' education, poverty, water scarcity, pollution, everything else, we're only reaching about 5% of success. And that's because the governments and the United Nations and the NGOs are never going to be equipped enough to do that. So we as human beings have to accept some responsibility. We have
Absolutely.
to basically figure out what our cause is and step up and do something. And don't listen to the things in our head that says, oh, well, I'm too busy, or what do I have to offer? I'm only a student. Put those things aside because we as human beings have to take some responsibility. In the
Absolutely.
absence of that, then, so one last thing I'll say about this is I called it "Be the Hero" because, a lot of people think heroes are people who run into burning buildings or, the kid's about to be hit by a bus and run, that is a heroism. But for me, heroism is when a person does a selfless act with no anticipation getting anything in return. It's a kindness. So if you do kind things, you should be rewarded. You're being heroic, and so
Absolutely.
if you help people to understand that they're heroic when they step up and volunteer and get involved, they feel good about themselves.
Absolutely. It again echoes my sentiments. It's exactly what I've said in the video that I'm going to show you a little later. That a hero is not somebody who just does something heroic like they show in the movies, but about someone who's championing change, about someone who's being the change and making a difference in their own small, significant way. So I'm happy that our thoughts resonate over there because I also write stories of heroes, and I think I was inspired by a man who actually moved a mountain with a hammer and
Wow.
a chisel, not with a bulldozer. And
Wow.
I had the privilege of meeting him, the honor of meeting him way back in 2003, which is
Mm-hmm.
exactly 21 years ago, when I
Right.
was getting set to launch a movement called the Joy of Giving, which has
Yeah.
now become a global movement. And
Yeah.
in the Joy of Giving, I basically wanted to show people how people live in a place called India,
Yeah.
which was at that time promoting a slogan called India Shining. And I
Yes.
said, India is shining for the few, but not for the many, because
Yeah.
the many
Yeah.
are actually whining and crying out there and dying
Yeah.
of
Yes.
chronic
Yes. Yes.
hunger. So,
Yes.
so yes. So thank you for bringing this out. Coming to your current book, which we are discussing today, which I think is a very burning issue, which is a very important issue that one needs to address. We do a lot of work on trafficking. I told you my real graduation and university schooling happened in a place called Kamatipura, which is one of the biggest
Yeah.
red light districts, as they are called in Bombay. You've been there, you said, with the cop.
Hmm.
I must also tell you this, and that kind of triggered it at that time, that when we launched the Karmavir Chakra Award in partnership with the UN in 2008, the
Mm.
first two people who were awarded were cops, ordinary
Yeah.
constables
That's
from
right.
UP and Bihar, who had
Yes.
gone beyond the call of duty and
Yes.
fought trafficking, because UP and Bihar also has huge trafficking issues because of the poverty over there. And poverty probably is the reason that trafficking manifests and thrives. So tell us a little more about this book. Where were you? A profile of modern slavery, and the work that you do along with Sylvia at the Mekong Club.
Okay, so let me just put it into perspective, some of the statistics. According to the United Nations, there's about 50 million people in modern slavery. About 23 million of them basically would be in forced marriages. These are not marriages where, they're going to procreate and have family and loving, caring situation. It's where a person is married into the family basically to work or to have a job that the money comes in and so forth. The other 27% would be forced labor, of which 6.3 million of that would be in forced prostitution. Each day, about 25,000 people somewhere in the world are entering into modern slavery. But this is where it gets really kind of crazy and to a certain extent depressing. Out of the 50 million people who were in modern slavery last year the world helped about 110,000, which is 0.2%, not even a half percent. Part of the reason for that is the profits generated from modern slavery are huge, 236 billion US dollars a year. The amount of money that's available to fight this globally with the United Nations and everything else is about 350 million, or 0.1% of the profits. So you have a huge profit base and you have virtually no resources. The number of people like me around the world that focus on this is about 30,000. The number of criminals is about a 500,000. We have to follow rules and regulations and rule of law and so forth. They don't have to do that. Lastly, awareness is very low. So I do a lot of talks, and I probably do about 150 talks a year now. I get in front of audiences of anywhere from 30 to 1,000 people, and most people don't know about this issue. So after talking for 20 minutes, I asked the audience, how many of you knew even 25% of what I was saying before I said it? And I don't usually get more than one or two hands, if any. So if you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. So the book was written because a lot of people kept saying to me, what book should I read in order to understand human trafficking? And, there are some books that focus on sex trafficking and some focus on forced labor, and some of them are dramatic and various other things. But, what I couldn't find was one that kind of encapsulated everything. So I started my journey 35 years ago at a time before human trafficking was even a name. Nobody was calling this anything at that time. And so my journey goes all the way back to the beginning. And so much of the book at the beginning chronicles the historical aspects of human trafficking, how the HIV/AIDS sector was an introduction to sex trafficking, because prior to kind of going in and doing safe sex talks and condom use talks and so forth, nobody paid any attention to women in prostitution. As we said, they were bad girls. But we were going and having conversations with them. And at the end of the conversation, we'd say, what's your story? And they talk about these horrific things about how they were tricked and deceived and forced into these circumstances. We said, wow, this is a huge human rights violation. So for years, I tried to go and get the US government interested in it. But, they said, we don't really know what this is and where it fits in. And so a lot of governments were like that. So what the book tries to do is to kind of look at the history, look at lots of cases. I talk about case examples, forced labor, fishing boats, domestic helper cases. And then I try to describe, what's being done and how it needs to be done. And I talk a little or a lot about my own experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I had some successful programs, but I had some horribly unsuccessful programs as well. And I think it's important as NGO people to be open to talk about our failures and to talk about what worked and why it worked and what didn't work and why it didn't work. And then at the end, it makes a call to action to say, we as human beings need to know about this. We need to figure out what we can do to help. And then we need to step up and help. And so the book kind of chronicles all of that.
Very nice. And tell us a little more about your work at the Mekong Club.
So the Mekong Club, I work for big bureaucracies. The U.S. government is a big bureaucracy, and the United Nations is a big bureaucracy. And I worked with a lot of small NGOs and INGOs and so forth. But one of the things that always kind of was most frustrating for me was the pace at which a lot of organizations worked. They didn't have a sense of urgency. And it's partly because bureaucracies just, muddle along at a particular pace. And so when I came to realize that within forced labor and even forced prostitution, there was a nexus with the banking industry and the hotel industry and the manufacturing industry and the retail industry, I said, okay, well, what I need to do is to work with the private sector, because despite what people feel about the private sector does care about this issue. Maybe not for benevolent reasons always, but because if they get caught in a situation where there's a sweatshop in their supply chain, they can be named and shamed. If a bank finds itself in a situation where any of that dirty money comes in, they can be fined and penalized. There was a bank in Australia fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars because they allowed this to happen. Hotels have sex trafficking taking place within the hotel. So what we do is we basically have an association. We work with major banks and manufacturers and retailers in the hospitality sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way. We educate them about the issue. We give them tools in order to address the issue. We basically do everything we can to help them to determine if they have vulnerability. And then if they find it, then we work with them to fix it. And so because of the sense of urgency of preventing something basically getting into social media or into the traditional media, they act very quickly. So you can see a lot of work being done within the private sector that nobody will talk about it because it's not one of those things that a company says, oh, well, we had forced labor and we fixed it. Nobody will ever say that. We know it's being fixed and it's being fixed and those people are being helped, but it's being done in such a way that the private sector does it and put systems and procedures in place so it doesn't continue afterward.
Great, super. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm glad to see all the good work that you and Sylvia are undertaking and implementing from your base in Hong Kong now in the field of in the sector of trafficking to address the burning issue of trafficking. When we had mailed you, we had shared with you about the global program that we are planning soon, which is about the Mojosh Magnificent Seven, which is
Mm-hmm.
a global storytelling event that we are planning. These are stories of people who are broken, either morally, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, or physically, but people who refuse to break down. We call them the human miracles, and people who are going beyond, and overcoming all their difficulties, all their fears, enduring suffering, enduring pain. And I'll show you some of the stories, and then I want to know your insights on resilience and what are your thoughts on resilience. So we have people who are physically disabled, we have people who are emotionally disabled, we have people who are mentally broken, we have people who are morally broken, people who are criminals, gangsters. And you spoke about how a whole lot of criminals and gangsters are involved in trafficking. But here we are talking about people who have reformed now and are going to be sharing their stories from the Mojosh Magnificent stage. And the whole idea is that how do we endure pain and suffering to come out and become better versions of us? That is Girish Gogia, who met with an accident a few years ago and is completely paralyzed and calls himself the positive man, right? So we have very compelling stories which we have curated from the world over. And we would like to invite you and if possible, Sylvia also to be a part of this and be a part of the storytelling experience that we are launching this year, first from India and then from other places like Hong Kong, Dubai, Singapore, etc. It's a hybrid event where people would join in as a part of the live audience in the stadium on ground, and we would have people joining in from around the world, hybrid, that is online, right? So, and we have people from all the communities, all genders, including from the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, people who are transgenders, people, because the whole idea is to also celebrate diversity and equity and inclusion. And I'll just wait for a little of the video to play and then tell you a little more about this. So Rashmi is a survivor of domestic violence, marital rape, and is a person who's emotionally broken, but again refuses to break down and has broken through. This is Nipun, who was born with arthrophogysis, which has paralyzed him right from from birth, and again came out a topper in economics in India and is now serving the disabled community. And that's where I'm explaining that I think a hero is someone who does something which may be very small, but is making a significant difference in our society and in our world. You know, a lot of people, Matt, they kind of pray to avoid suffering. They'll do whatever possible to think that they should never be kind of subjected to any pain or any struggle or suffering, without realizing that that is what stops their path to growth, and that is what the science of resilience shows you. So one is, we would love you to be a part of the Mojosh Magnificent Seven storytelling event series. Second is, what are your thoughts on resilience? What are your thoughts on pain, suffering, endurance, and how does that really help to make you a better version of yourself? You've gone through
Well,
it,
I
so
mean,
I
I
would
had,
like to hear it from you.
okay, about 5 years ago, I had prostate cancer, and it was serious enough that it could have killed me. And so a lot of people would say, "Oh my gosh, that's terrible. That's an awful thing. You have the operation, you have to live with that, and you didn't know whether you're going to survive or not." For me, it was one of the best things that happened to me in my life. The reason why I say that is that it was a wake up call for the fact that we are all mortal. Many of us go through life thinking, well, we have lots of years and we can go on forever and, it's going to be okay. But that particular period in my life forced me to stop and think about, am I where I want to be? What does life mean to me? What does life mean in my marriage and with my kids and all these other things? And I had a predisposition for blood clots. So I went into the operation not knowing if I would wake up because it had killed my mom and had other issues with family members and so forth. So I said goodbye to everybody. And then sure enough, I woke up and like every day it's like, woo woo, I'm alive, woo woo, I'm alive. And so you appreciate life a lot more. The other things is, I mean, the things that you feel most concerned about, the things that you're not very good at, should be the things that you run toward. And this thing about being fearful of failing, and I hate to say it, but in Asia, there's this almost cult that says you can't fail at anything, and so people are so fearful of failure. In my
We don't
program,
have a culture of failure. Yes,
well, I go to my when I was running the United Nations, I'd say you're not succeeding unless you're failing 3 or 4 times. Try some
absolutely. And I
stuff out.
completely
If it
agree with
doesn't
you.
work, because that's where your lessons come from. That's where you come to realize that it's okay to fail. It's because if you don't try things, you don't know if that particular ideal is going to take off. And maybe it will. And if it takes off, then great. But you'll never know if you basically say, I'm not going to put it out there because I'm afraid maybe it won't. So that maybe it won't phrase that goes in your mind over and over again is what basically prevents you from moving forward. And that's why so many super talented people never reach their full potential. And this is what I look at when it comes to human beings. You know, we as human beings have the ability to improve and get better and succeed at so many things. You don't even know what your glass ceiling is because so many people are still down here. The best thing in life to do is to try something. And if you fail, you fail, try something else or whatever. All of the great minds and leaders in the world basically became that way because they were willing to take chances and they were willing to fail and they were willing to learn from their failures and they weren't bogged down by it. They don't obsess with the idea that this is, oh, I failed, therefore I'm a bad person or whatever. Get over that. Just go into it and experiment and try to reach your full potential as a human being.
Very nice. Thank you so much for that. Completely echoes with what I share with my audiences around the world, that if you don't have a culture of failure, you can never experiment with your life, you can never innovate, and you can never go beyond. And if you see, those are our values. Our values, we've summed it up in one word: thrive. And like I always say, are you alive and thriving, or are you existential and surviving? They are two different energies. And thrive, again, is an acronym for transformation. Humor is all about how do you learn to laugh at your own situation. Like you said, you survived cancer and you think it's a blessing for you because that helped you to become a much better version of yourself. R is for resilience. I is for initiative. Take initiatives to reinvent yourself, remodel yourself, recreate yourself. Vulnerability, understand that you cannot succeed all the time. Yeah, you're vulnerable as a human being. Success is not in your control. And the energy to stay there, no matter how broken you are, how to stay there with perseverance, with grit, with resilience, with endurance, and to understand that I can break through because this too shall pass and I can resist this situation and come out better and keep moving on. So thank you for
Well,
that.
actually, let me just say one more thing about that. And that, the story that I started off with about my journey was about a failure. I didn't
Right.
say that I, went into there and I grabbed the girl and helped her out and I'm a hero. I went in there
Absolutely.
basically saying that I failed miserably. But that
Absolutely.
failure in my particular case has been the motivating factor after all these years to want to continue to do this. I still see seared in my mind that 11-year-old girl, and I still feel like I haven't, even after 35 years, done enough to accommodate. I hope if she knew I was doing it, she'd feel proud that this is what I'm doing in my life. So I don't know. It's just one of those things.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with you. While it frustrates you at many levels, it also kind of helps you to see that this could be my calling. The first person who saw the potential in me to become a teacher was a commercial sex worker who I used to call Suni Didi in the brothels of
Mhm.
Kamatipura. And she told me that you have a way of working with children, of teaching children. So why don't you become a teacher? And I said, no, no, no. I plan to start my first venture soon. I need to make some money because I was. I've lived my childhood in penury because my father passed away young. We got cheated out of the property, etc. And my mom and I went through our own journey. But anyway, what literally happened to me in Kamatipura while working with those kids was, that here I was crying that I had no shoes till I met these kids who had no feet, right? And
Yeah,
that literally
that's
happened to me
right.
from a very ungrateful rebel without a cause. I turned out to be grateful for everything in my life, and I think that's what keeps us going with our activism. You spoke about how the UN, the USAID, all have their different levels of bureaucracy, and hats off to you and salute, a huge salute to you to have endured that. Because I do a lot of work with the UN, and sometimes I feel it very frustrating because there's so much of red tape, and instead of getting the work done, you're just kind of wrapping people around with more and more red tape, right? Currently, I mean, I'm going to draw your attention, and I'm sure you are vocal about it too. But I'm working with a whole lot of activists from around the world, which include people not only from the Muslim community, but from the Christian community, from the Jew community, and from several other communities from around the world, from the people from the United States, people from places in Europe, UK, people from places in Turkey, Lebanon, who are all very vocal about what is happening in Palestine from October 7th onwards. And while there is an entire narrative being put out there about how Hamas did whatever they did on October 7th, and I'm sure that a lot of people from Israel, innocent people, had to go through that pain and suffering. But unfortunately, whether it's Hamas or the entire issue of Palestine, is created by the West. And right now, what a lot of people, including the students who are protesting in the US or in the UK or in places in Europe, are actually saying that the UN is absolutely important. Most countries are people in the government of most countries are war criminals because unfortunately, whether we like it or not, they're the minions of the military-industrial complex. Today, universities in the United States stand exposed, where you can see a lot of their endowment funds are actually kind of invested in the military-industrial complex and companies which kind of uh, are the military-industrial complex. What do you think the UN or countries like US, UK could do better right now? And do you think they're doing something at all? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we have to, at the end of the day, accept the fact that a human being is a human being is a human being. There's no
Absolutely true.
human being that is more than or less than anybody else, that everybody's the same. So
Absolutely.
throughout my entire career, whether it's an ambassador or the person who's serving my food, they're all the same to me.
Very
I
true.
think the UN, they basically 20 years ago was a lot more actively involved in this type of activity. They would have, for example, during the Iraq War and some of those other conflicts, they would have regular uh, security meetings. It would be publicized. It was be debated and discussed. The world has changed a lot since then, where it used to be that you would have a certain number of countries that would come together when conflicts occurred, and they would be making decisions and everything else. The United Nations was involved. You'd see it on television on a regular basis. But that world's changed, and part of it's post-COVID. Part of it is the Ukraine war, the conflict that we're talking about. Elections in the United States, all kinds of things that are distractions, and as a result of that, the prevailing sense of human rightsness is sometimes lost in that process. Now, if we use history as an example, after the 9/11 attack, you basically had a lot of sympathy for the United States. And people were basically saying, wow, we really feel bad. Now, the US could have kind of used that sympathy and systematically over time address this issue in a way that didn't result in several wars taking place and a lot of people being hurt and so forth. But they chose to be aggressive and to move forward. It's exactly what we're seeing with the topic you're talking about. A human being is a human being is a human being. We have to be concerned about everyone involved. We have to be concerned about who
Absolutely.
are the victims and who are the perpetrators, and we have to do it in a way that doesn't completely destroy or disenfranchise lots of people. So, as a human rights person, my kind of advice is, if something like that happens, you take a deep breath, you sit down, and you approach the situation from what's the way of moving forward to have the least number of innocent people being hurt. That's it. You know.
Thank you for that, Matt. I mean that's been my challenge also. I left the business and the profit sector way back in 2002 and joined the not-for-profit sector, and then realized that the not-for-profit sector is full of people who are just career climbers. And that's fine, but if you're not focusing on the cause that you're addressing and not making an impact over there, then you're just taking a salary and climbing that corporate career. And I think those kind of people in the aid sector should probably kind of rethink what they are really there for. And I think that's a thought I want to leave behind with all the aid workers. The final thing I want to discuss with you, Matt, is about storytelling. Like I told you, we would be taking this video to a whole lot of students in schools, and we had shared the storytelling tutorial with you since you've written so many books, right? This is The Hero's Journey by Philip Campbell, and of course every book has a call for action, where the hero emerges from her or his ordinary life, whether it's books like the Odyssey, or the books like To Kill a Mockingbird, right? So what are the processes that you follow as a writer, and what are your thoughts and insights for young writers who want to script their books and pen their books? And how do you think they should go about writing their books and bringing it to life?
Okay. To me, there are three things that a writer has to have. They have to be able to write, they have to have something to say, and they have to have the diligence and perseverance to finish things. So I know a lot of people who are amazing writers when it comes to the first two chapters, but they don't have the fortitude or the drive to continue moving on. Like you said, it could take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years to birth a book. And so if you don't have that ability to finish things, then it doesn't matter how good a writer you are, you're not going to be able to achieve. So I have, in the early days, I was an okay writer. And, when it came to having something to say, I didn't have as much to say when I did my first book versus now. But I grew up in a German household where, we persevered. If you said you're going to do something, you're going to do it. So like
Right.
an hour a
You
day,
got to take it to its logical conclusion.
yeah, hour a day, every day. I'd wake up at like 6 in the morning for an hour and a half. I would write. And, some days I'd be able to write 2 pages, and some days I could write 2 sentences, and some days I would play around with things. But, you really have to not dream about having a book. You got to actually sit in front of a computer and put your word or whatever um, typing word processing thing you have in front of you and just start. And so, what I often say to people is when you do your initial writing, just put anything down. Just it could be garbled, maybe it's not. Just put it down and you start, and then you go back and you play around with it. You edit it, you make it a little bit better. Then you maybe think about, well, what's the next chapter going to be, and you work on that, and you do a little bit of that, and you keep going back and forth. But it really just comes down to sheer determination to to go forward. Now, the one thing that I can say to just about every person out there who's listening today is every one of you has a book in you. Every one of you has a story to tell. Every
Very
one of you
nice.
has something that's worthwhile. But the problem is that you don't believe that. Now, for me, I never aspired to be an author. Somebody else put my book in. I never would have done it. I've all the other books I'm in. I'm like, I put it in, or somebody comes to approaches me, and I'm like, whoa, they're going to publish that? Really? I mean, I'm surprised, but it's not who I am as a person. So I'm not wrapped up in it. If you commit yourself to wanting to be a writer, but you never get in front of a computer and do it, then you're not a writer. You're a writer when you're writing. And you're a writer when you're writing bad stuff initially, and then better stuff, and good stuff, and great stuff. That happens over time. Expect that the first book isn't going to be so great. And maybe a lot of people aren't going to like it. They're going to tell you that you got to change things. Listen to them. Don't take it personally. Don't get your feelings hurt. My mom initially on the first couple of books, she was just like, oh, like a son. When you come home when you're 5 years old and you have a picture and you draw it, and, oh, it's so beautiful. She'd say that. But then, like on the fourth book, she said, I think that was mom, mom. Oh, my mom doesn't like it. It must be horrible. But it was exactly what I needed to hear. So
Right.
basically, having a thick skin, sitting down, committing yourself to doing it, and then getting on with it. And if it's your dream to have a book, then fulfill your dream. And everyone on this can do it. Every one of you. There's no reason why people can't write books. Anyone can do it.
Very nice. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Matt. And I completely agree with you. Keep an open mind to embrace feedback. Like I always say, feedback is the multivitamin of champions for continuous improvement. So don't take what people say to you negatively, take it positively, even if it is negative. And I think one of the things which I completely agree with, it's like singing the same song. That to be a writer, you need to keep penning your thoughts, keep scribbling your thoughts. It's therapeutic any which way, and maybe after a few weeks, after a few months, you will get it right, and you will see the plot emerging. And of course, to keep scribbling and writing your thoughts, you need to read and research better. So invest time in that, because if you're not a good reader, you cannot be a good writer. And of course, like Matt said, you got to believe in yourself that I can write and I can get a book out there. So that belief is very important. Finally, Matt, to conclude, I like that one line that you gave us today. I care so much that I don't care at all.
Yes.
What are the three life lessons that you would like to leave behind with everybody in the audience on Facebook Live and people who are going to see this video later on? What are the three life lessons that you would want to leave them behind with, which have served you well in your journey of life?
Okay. The first one is don't be afraid of life. And that means, don't be afraid of failure. Don't be afraid of fear. Don't be afraid of what your family thinks and what your friends think or any of those kind of things. Just kind of accept the fact that if you feel a righteous sense of wanting to do something and you have a strong feeling, just go ahead and do it. And because the moment you release yourself from that scenario, then you're free. The second thing is basically to kind of understand the concept of reaching your full potential. There are some people who get to a particular point in their life, and that's as far as they're going to grow. And they have the potential to grow so much more, but they just kind of stop there. They kind of accept this is who I am. And they're very unapologetic about it. That this is just the way I am. Well, that's fine if you accept that. But if you want to be more and you're just settling for the status quo, then you're not reaching your full potential as a human being. The last one is to embrace kindness and compassion and love. There's just so much negative, and there's so much hatred, and there's so much anger, and there's so much. The world doesn't have to be that way. And the way we change that is if each person accepts these positive elements of being there for other people, supporting other people, being a part of the community to bring the community forward and so forth, we would have a much, much, much better world. Those are the three things that I would respond to this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. And there's a lot of research to show, which shows that people who are kind are better human beings, are stronger human beings, are more wiser human beings who have common sense, who have basic intelligence, who have great emotional intelligence. The study also shows that people who are unkind, people who are only self-serving, are actually the most arrogant and also the most foolish people on earth, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's very important for people to know. And I like what you said, Matt, that don't settle for ordinary, go for extraordinary, because you have it within you, and it's a choice that you need to make to go for extraordinary and go beyond. So thank you so much, Matt, for making the time. That was Matt Friedman. Please do go and buy his books. They're available on Amazon. And thank you, Matt, for joining us. Thank you to everyone who had joined us on FB Live. I hope you all got some good leadership, life, and learning to learn lessons. And see you again next Sunday.
I just want one more thing to say. I do have a novel that's based in India on human trafficking called Dancing in the Light of the Moon. And it's just another way of educating, informing people, because sometimes the nonfiction doesn't reach people, but fiction does. 10 years of research in order to do that.
So is that novel out already?
It's out and it's available on Amazon.
Very nice. Dancing in the Light of Moon. Very nice.
Yes.
Brilliant title. So thank you so much, Matt. Our regards to Sylvia and all the good work that you're doing at the Mekong Club. We'll write to Sylvia also. Would love to have her on the AuthoREXperience podcast. Thank you, and thank you for making the time to join us. See you. Bye-bye.